Hey, everybody. Welcome back to LA Not So Confidential's Behind the Couch. It's just me solo this time. Dr. Shiloh double booked, the most organized person in the world. And the first time she double booked and forgot about it. She is at Halloween Horror Nights at Universal, having the time of her life as always. And she'll be checking in with us, hopefully, if she can get a good signal over there, and saying hi and maybe sending some pics to our Discord channel or posting on the Facebook page. So we have a special guest this week. Very excited about that. But before we get started, I want to do a shout out to all of our new Patreon members. And we had a lot in the last couple of months. It's very, very exciting. So I want to give a great welcome to Jason B, Cheryl F, Marjorie F, Jackson D, Taylor H, Kalia, Laura P, Tina P, Virginia C, Deanna G, Mandy L, and Nancy W. We announced 2 winners this week, and those prizes will go out along with some super cool swag from the last couple of conventions that we've been to. All that will go out in the next week to our existing Patreon members and to our new members. We're, again, always so grateful that you guys are here and showing up. Just very, very exciting, helping us to produce these shows. So I'm going to bring in our guest, and he's connecting, Dr. Ryan Solomon. So, we don't do a ton of interviews on our podcast, and we probably should do more. We should probably do more guests here on Behind the Couch. Hey, Ryan. So just stand there and look awkward while I do my wonderful introduction of you. So I want to welcome Dr. Ryan Solomon to our show today. He is a licensed clinical psychologist working in forensics. So he has specialized training in forensics. He specializes in a very specific and very important area of psychology and risk assessment these days, especially in today's climate, workplace violence, as well as an exceptional amount of training in threat assessment, risk management, and crisis intervention. He has over 5 years of experience with the city of Los Angeles. He conducts psychological pre-employment evaluations for job applicants for sworn and civilian positions within the city. Incredibly important job and incredibly high level of responsibility. Dr. Ryan also serves as the coordinator of the citywide threat assessment team, providing threat assessment, risk management, training, and consultation services throughout the city of LA to mitigate workplace violence and promote safety in the workplace. So Dr. Solomon spent several years working with LA County's Department of Mental Health in partnership and collaboration with LAPD's Mental Evaluation Unit. And he is a certified LAPD instructor and crisis responder, and played a prominent role promoting mental health awareness to patrol officers within the department, as well as providing mental health crisis intervention and response to community members. LAPD's Mental Evaluation Unit has received worldwide recognition for its contributions to community policing and the field of forensic mental health. So are you embarrassed yet that we have to read your whole intro?
Like you wouldn't believe it.
Good. No. I was there. I saw you do it all. It's awesome. So, hey, thanks so much for taking the time to
absolutely
sit with us today. This is the kind of stuff, our podcast has a solid following that slowly grows over the years. And I brag on our listeners all the time. I think they're some of the most intelligent, thoughtful listeners who offer us wonderful critique and feedback. And this is the kind of stuff that really gets them going. They're not all about like the mayhem and murder of true crime, but actually all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. So whenever we have the opportunity to introduce people to them that actually work in the field to the extent that you do, we just always want to illuminate and highlight and, shed some light on what people are doing in your responsibilities. So as all of our listeners know, Shiloh and I talk a lot about our backgrounds and how we ended up where we are today. And I was wondering if you might tell us a little bit about yourself. Were you somebody knowing that you were going to go into this field from the very beginning, or how did you end up getting where you are?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm a big fan of the podcast and of
Thank
Dr.
you.
Scott and Dr. Shiloh. So I appreciate you guys. It's a pleasure to be here. With regards to how it all began, so I came from a psychology background. So my dad is a clinical psychologist and
Okay.
my mom's a retired psychiatric nurse. So that set me on the path.
I had no idea. That's fascinating.
Yeah. They actually met at a psychiatric hospital, believe it or not. So that kind of just set me on the pathway. I was always kind of very psychologically minded. And, I grew up watching a lot of Law and Order SVU. So I was like inspired early on by the forensic psychologist, Dr. Wong, who is highly, praised in that show. And then in his role in assisting in solving psychological crime and assisting law enforcement.
Right.
I got my start in college at UC Irvine, and I majored in psychology and criminology. And I kind of always weighed which path I wanted to go. There was the lawyer path and then the psychology path. And I was kind of torn. And, the more classes I took, I always really enjoyed studying human behavior. But what really got me interested was criminal behavior. And that's what always really fascinated me was criminal behavior and the abnormal psychology. And so I pursued a career in forensic psychology. I got my doctorate as a forensic psychologist. And that kind of just got me in all of these different forensic type settings where I learned, so much and was exposed to so much. I grew up in one of the biggest bubbles you can grow up in Southern California,
Yeah.
in Orange County. And I was immediately thrusted out of the bubble in one of my very first jobs with the Department of Mental Health, working at a female juvenile probation camp.
Wow.
And that really, they were primed to, eat me alive over there. I think I graduated when I was 26. I looked like I was 15. And, it was such an eye-opening experience. And then it kind of just really got me started in, this pathway towards working in the field of forensics.
So it's interesting because it seems to be a majority of people that come into our field that come from, these days at least, they come from other disciplines. And like Shiloh and I, it was like hers not so much, mine definitely was a midlife career change. But you're saying that you knew, especially from the bubble you grew up in, you knew kind of where the direction of where you were going. Does that mean that did you do your undergrad in psych as well?
I did, yeah. So my undergraduate was in psychology and criminology.
That's really smart.
Yeah, so the combination of the both is forensic psychology. It's the application of psychology to criminology. And it was really just kind of a perfect fit. I did my undergraduate at UC Irvine, and they're very heavily focused and kind of fixated on miscarriages of justice and how psychology can be applied to criminology and kind of fixing these miscarriages of justice. And I was always interested in investigative psychology and putting the pieces of the puzzle together. And I kind of just found a perfect fit in this field.
So I had no idea that that's where you came from. And that makes I have a question that's not on my list of questions that I prepared, because I'll tell you, to give you a background for the question, is like, I always tell people, if you're considering this field, you have to make it through the bachelor's level of a psychology degree, because you're not even getting to all the fun stuff. You're getting to like the most basic sort of mechanics of human behavior, like the foundation, without getting to what we call the abnormal stuff, which the abnormal stuff is way more interesting and actually way more prevalent in the big picture. So are you saying that Irvine's program, do they, even at the bachelor's level, do they kind of emphasize that, we're trying to make you look at something bigger? Because I remember my undergrad psych classes were just like the most basic behavioral, pigeons pecking at a bar for corn nuggets or something.
Right. Pavlov.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, they really dive into abnormal psychology, and you really get an inside look into, even beyond like criminal behavior and how psychology is, applied in forensics. And I think they really do a great job in really preparing psychologists for the field and the reality of, the world.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, the beginning intro to psychology is just kind of so sugar coated, and there's just a lot of Disneyland type rhetoric with the beginning type
Right.
phases of psychology, but they really lift the lid, and you see behind the curtain into some of the really harsh realities of psychology and what's out there. So I thought they kind of do a great job of preparing their students pretty well for those realities.
So thanks for that. I think that's going to be very valuable. We have a surprising number of people that discover this podcast, and it ends up being the trigger that gets them to follow this career path. So that information is going to be super helpful. So I knew you, we met when you were at SMART, which is the first responder position, which is a co-responder model. Very, very important. I don't think that SMART gets nearly as much. And what's the acronym stand for? So it's system-wide
mental assessment response team.
So for those out there who are listening, Ryan worked in a co-responder model as a clinician with a law enforcement officer. And the whole intent of this program was to put a professional on scene in high acuity settings to be able to address whatever was coming up, whether it was someone who was suicidal, whether it was someone who was suicidal and holding a child with a knife at both of their throats, or bomb threats, or climbing to the top of one of the overpasses off the 101 freeway. And that's just the tip of the iceberg for the type of situations that Ryan and his peers dealt with. So what's so funny to me in working with you guys is, and also the sort of the job responsibilities that I have in the follow-up of what you do, is like, we have the craziest stories, and over time they just become so banal. Like, I will be talking to my husband or something, I'll go, oh yeah, we had a case where da 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 da, and then suddenly I look up and everybody is just horrified because they're not in our field at all. You realize, like, oh wow, my baseline is really off for what is normal human behavior, right?
Oh yeah.
So when you left emergency response and you transitioned over to doing this similar but very different type of work, how was it for you? And was it what you were expecting?
It was really tough. I think down the road, you're going to ask me about my dream job, and working with and alongside law enforcement really was my dream job. I loved the field work. And what I wasn't really expecting with that particular job was, you are working with a family, and they really are a community, and it's so tightly knit, and they get to learn what you do in your profession, your personal life, and then you get to learn how they do their job and their career. And just the camaraderie is, I think, what I miss the most. So kind of going into, I transitioned over to city personnel, where I started doing pre-employment psychological evaluations for safety sensitive positions, such as law enforcement, firefighters, detention officers. And, I kind of found myself doing psychological assessment, which I've always really wanted to do. But, you kind of really miss working as part of a team. You miss the field work, getting out behind the desk, actually being involved in, making an actual difference in saving people's lives, kind of on a different level. Although the work that I did with pre-employment evaluations is, really important, because you're assessing, the psychological suitability of these candidates who are eventually going to go into law enforcement and protect the community. And so screening those candidates are critical to changing the culture of the department and to changing the culture of policing. And I felt, coming from MEU, that and SMART, I was a really good fit, because I really knew what it was that made a good police officer. And I also really knew what it was that made poor police officers. So it was really, it was really good. And it was a great fit. So in a way, it was a new challenge, and it was exciting. But, I really do miss going out in the field. I miss kind of, working in partnership, going out and saving lives, and some of that, practical type field work that we did. There's like the excitement. I had the night shift the whole time I was there. So I was working from 3 p.m. to 3 a.m. for, the better course of 5 years. And you're just kind of, your adrenaline is always running, and, your eyes are stapled wide open, and it's just kind of a a rush and a whirlwind. And then, the transition over to, work behind a desk is very different. So
Yeah.
it definitely was a transition. And now I've kind of find myself in a role closer to where I was doing a little bit more field work. But it's been great. Overall, I've been really happy with my career path, and yeah, it's been good.
Yeah, that seems to be one of the things that's commented on most is when people move from that high adrenaline type of activity to something that is more not sedentary, but it's a very different type of energy. It can be just as exhausting. But one of the things that is fascinating too is about the shift that you worked on. So you're working at a shift, because my version of that was working at the jail until 5 a.m. 4 nights a week, which is,
Yep.
You just, people are different after 10 p.m. The people you
changes.
work with, you're different. The world is different, right?
Yeah.
So you would get called on some pretty significant calls because it's stuff that's happening in the middle of the night, right?
Right. Well, yeah. Well, once I remember, once it hits 10 o'clock, that's when, it's Los Angeles, something's going to happen. You're going to get called out, whether it's a mental health crisis, a SWAT team co-response, barricade, a jumper. So you have to be pretty alert, and your brain has to be working at 10 p.m. at night when it's usually past your bedtime. So I was still, to this day, I'm still kind of a little bit wired around 10 o'clock at night when I should be, sound asleep.
You should be winding down. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow.
But for years, that would be like halfway through our shift is, 10 o'clock, we'd be smack in the middle of our work day in a way. And sometimes we'd have to work overtime, and we could have been on calls, up until 5, 6 a.m. and have to be back at it again the next day in the early afternoon. So, but yeah, I absolutely loved it. It really was my dream job. And I have all the stories that will last me a lifetime. So I really did love the work there.
Yeah, it really gives you a different perspective on humanity. I had a recent issue where, we get a referral and we're trying to help someone. We're really trying to help someone and keep a family safe. And a lot of times there's a communication between SMART or my version where we're collaborating with the care group of the individual. Like, say you've had to go and you've had to go into a house where somebody's fully armed and making threats. And I remember this is now the third time that's happened, that, the therapist of that individual won't help you. Like they're really kind of hooked on this HIPAA thing and protecting, and that, like, it's 2 a.m. and you're trying to explain to a therapist, no, I need you to collaborate with us in order to de-escalate this situation. And then you find out they're feeding completely different information to the client just because they don't sit where we sit, right? They don't understand that emergency response. So yeah, it's a peculiar type of work, and thank you for all the time that you gave to it. And I'm glad you're on a regular sleep schedule, because it's going to do you well.
Yes.
For the next decades of your life. So going on, let's talk a little bit more about your current expectation. I mean, not expectation, but your current position. So you're working basically kind of banker's hours, right? Do you get are you working a 410 or a 980 or?
In a way, it's a 980, but with my particular position, technically we're 24/7. So so we do threat assessment for the entire city. So, threats often come in at all hours of the day, but mostly during work hours when everyone's working.
Okay.
But yeah, so technically I'm on a 980 schedule and have a typical, 9 to 5 type shift. But, we could get a referral, or there could be a potential threat, or something that we're always available to assist with if needed.
Okay. So let me ask you this then. I know that you can't, there's a lot tell us about pre-employment screening. Like, what all does that entail? So for all of our laymen out there that don't really have much of experience with this, tell us what that entails.
So for pre-employment psychological evaluations, technically, the point is to assess psychological suitability. So we administer psychological assessments, we conduct a clinical interview, we review their background history, And when candidates go through the application process, psychology is the last line of defense. We're the last part of the process. So they go through their polygraph, their medical, their drug tests, their background, and the very last part of the process before going on to the academy or going on to starting probation is to do their psychological interview. And so we do a 1 to 2 hour clinical interview, and we review the results of their psychological testing. We review their background history. If they have a history of, mental health treatment, we'll review their records, and we determine whether or not they're psychologically suitable for the position based on a number of different dimensions, from, emotional regulation to stress tolerance, integrity, assertiveness and persuasiveness, adaptability, flexibility. So there's a lot of things that we know that studies have shown make very high-performing, good police officers, and that there's certain traits that make poor ones. And so that's kind of how we assess that suitability.
So tell us about the main tools that you use for assessment. It's got to be, I'm clearly MMPI is going to be the big one, right? Okay.
Correct. Yeah.
What
that's
else?
That's pretty much the standard, the MMPI 3, which we've recently transitioned to, and the CPI. So we use an abnormal and normal psychological assessment tool. We also will use the sentence completion, and we'll have a personal history questionnaire as well. And so, we kind of conceptualize and in a way profile each candidate to determine their suitability.
So let me ask you this then, because for those out there that are listening that are not familiar with these tests that we're talking about, the MMPI is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Index. Is that, I've been so long since I've done, is that the right acronym?
Yeah,
okay. Wow. I actually remembered it after all these years. It's an amazing tool, and it gets more and more refined and modernized with every version. And it's really great. Like there's always in the crime movies, they always want to have the Hannibal Lecter or someone that's such a genius that they can fool the MMPI, when in actuality, would be almost impossible to, because there are so many measures built into it. And it's fascinating to read. Like if you're ever prepared, when you can sit down and you're allowed to look at the results of your MMPI, it can be really illuminating to read your own test, right?
Oh yeah.
So talk about the CPI that you mentioned.
Right. So the CPI will measure different types of traits like dominance, empathy, self-control. So there's different types of personality traits that we look for and kind of measure in combination with each other to determine, how someone will react to stress, if they're stress reactive, or if they have issues with authority or self-control. So there's just different types of indices that we can determine if they have elevations on or if they have low scores on. And that, coupled with the MMPI, those two assessments together, gives a pretty good picture of how, someone might respond in a high stress situation like police work.
Yeah, in the lectures that I do, you and I both participated in a program where we provided mental health intervention training to officers, and sort of this as part of like a 40-hour immersive week with really cutting edge presentations for law enforcement. And one of the things that I use in my PowerPoint to this day is the stats on the most stressful fields. And the top 3 fields, first of all, which is probably surprising to some people, is fire department, fire response. Oh, yeah. And then second is law enforcement. And third is like Fortune 500 CEO, which is kind of a wild little jumble of things there you wouldn't expect.
Right.
I always thought that my anecdotal theory on why firemen would come out higher is because they're not necessarily inoculated to stress the way that law enforcement is, because law enforcement is a slow, steady burn. Whereas fire response would just be up, down, up, down, up, down. So they're never really given the opportunity, which means down the road, they're going to be less inoculated against the effects of stress.
Right.
But can you talk about what something on one of those rubrics that would just knock somebody out completely, like from the get-go?
I mean, there's not one scale that could potentially knock someone out. There are different scales of concern that we'll pay extra attention to, like the dominance scale. So we're worried that if someone becomes a police officer, that they will abuse their authority.
Right.
And so if someone is scoring really high on the scale of dominance and really low on the scale of empathy, that suggests that that combination is a pretty high indicator that this person might or likely will abuse their power in the field, handling certain calls or situations with, members of the community. So that's kind of one that stands out. But, the like you mentioned, the applicants for law enforcement and the applicants for firefighters are so different, and their test results are so different.
It's a very different personality, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And
Yeah.
the cultures are different, and they come from different, socioeconomic backgrounds and different educations, and they create completely different profiles. Now, the standard with which we might pass someone is lower because with firefighters, they're not armed. And so there's a different threshold for how we put firefighters through compared to law enforcement officers, if that makes sense. But yeah, I think there's definitely a different profile. And, when they take these assessments, they want to look as good as they can. They want the job. And so there's a lot of the times where the tests are so defensive that,
because it shows all that, but the test will reveal those. Not necessarily faking good, but it's more invested in presenting well, right? Like overly invested.
Impression management, right?
Okay.
Yeah. And so, they want the job. They don't want to portray a negative side of themselves. They don't want to portray themselves as, too aggressive or not aggressive enough, or, so you can tell there are times where they're just trying to beat the test and portray what they think will make a good police officer or firefighter. So they try to be very meticulous, but again, we can really assess for that and see right through it. And that's why we do a supplemental clinical interview where we spend, an hour and a half doing a structured interview with them that goes through early childhood and background history to elementary school to college, relationship history, employment. We have to know everything about you. So with the clinical interview, that kind of really helps us fill in some of those gaps and those holes that we'll get with, defensive tests.
Yeah, I just suddenly thought that somebody needs to get the rights to or make a version of the CPI and put it on a dating app. That would be a great way to screen people for Hinge and Bumble and Grindr. Any of those out there could be more successful with that.
I could not agree more. 100%.
Yeah. So, let me ask you this then. This is something that I find fascinating about people that work in our field as well as law enforcement is after a period of time working in a very intense area of this, we all develop a sixth sense. It's really only a handful of law enforcement, a handful of peers of our clinicians that I've met that never develop it. Like again, as a professional, I don't want to prejudge. I don't want to profile immediately, but you get a twinge in your stomach sometimes when people come in, and most of the time that bears out to be right, mainly because it's what we're used to. It's like our intuition is basically just the amalgamation of so much sensory input that our brain is, synthesizing that we're not aware of. So I wanted to put that back on you and say, have you had those types of experiences where someone's walked in the door and you've thought, nope?
Yes.
I know you're limited as to what you could say, but I find that fascinating in our field.
And again, spending so much time out in the field and, really seeing everything and everyone, you see the whole spectrum of who people are, and you're able to kind of size up people relatively quickly in a way and have a really good understanding of who they are. And being in forensics, you spend all these years, having people trying to manipulate you or try and, fabricate things or twist the truth, confabulate. I had a dissertation that I did in malingering. And so just having a really good idea of, who people are, how they'll respond under stress, what they're like with their families or their friends in different environments, in a way, just kind of profiling them to have a good understanding of the type of character that they are. And so that's why I really felt comfortable in this type of work, doing these psychological assessments, being around so many types of different characters and people And I just feel it just came really natural to me, kind
Yeah.
of being able to, you know, see through people in a way. Sometimes,
Well,
especially with
given the parents you grew up with their
yeah.
skill set, I'm surprised you trust anybody in the world.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
But
And
I'm
so
sure you have healthy skepticism of interpersonal relationships.
definitely, yeah, absolutely. And it's really helped me. And now I'm doing primarily threat assessment. I'm the coordinator for the citywide threat assessment team now, and I'm definitely able to utilize those skills in this work as well. And
Well,
so
tell us
it's
about
really
that process. Like, how would you get a referral? How does the
so
whole tell us, like, take us from point A to point Z on how that works out.
yeah, so the city of Los Angeles has a citywide threat assessment team. It's part of the workplace violence policy. And it dates back to 1995 when CTAT was created in response to the Piper Tech shooting. You're familiar with the
Yeah.
incident at Piper Tech. There was a worker who received a poor work performance evaluation and came to work the next day and shot and killed 4 of his supervisors. And what was really tragic about that whole incident was that there were so many opportunities for interventions to be made. And there were so many what we call pre-incident indicators and risk factors that if people were just actually able to share information and identify some of those warning signs, a tragic incident like this could have been prevented. And so CTAT was born, and CTAT consists of the psychology section, which is myself, LAPD's threat management unit, the city attorney's office, LAPD security services division, and LAPD's behavioral science services. And I'm the coordinator. I receive all of the types of threats and referrals that come through all citywide departments, from the zoo to the library to the accounting office to the animal shelters. And what we do is we investigate and evaluate different types of threats that come in, whether they're external or internal. And I work with an excellent team. We all collaborate together to investigate these types of threats and mitigate them. And yeah, I really think we have one of the best threat assessment teams in the nation. I'm really proud of the type of work that we do. Workplace violence has increased tremendously post-COVID. It's pretty remarkable. It wasn't only a physical lockdown during COVID, but an emotional lockdown.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And this has really, we're really in the middle of a mental health crisis where we have predominantly symptoms of paranoia have skyrocketed, I've noticed in our type of work. And just in general, people are just not feeling safe in the workplace. People are scared, and it's not, especially in Los Angeles, it can be a very difficult place to work, whether it's people you're working with internally or some of what we see on the news, some of the external threats and violence that people at the workplace are subjected to. And it's scary. I think people come to work and they're afraid. And so
Yeah, I'm really glad that you hit on that. There's a fascinating article that just came out the other day about retail workers and restaurant workers who were retail and restaurant, food service or hospitality prior to COVID. And now they've come back and we're back in the full swing. Yeah. And over again, they're reporting how difficult it is to work with the public as compared to before, because it feels like they've had no socialization. Not the retail workers, but the individuals have no socialization. They have sort of been in their own bubble. They've been in their apartment for 2.5 years. And it really created this deficit in their interpersonal relationships, which is always fascinating to me when we talk about people, not everyone, but certain individuals with autism spectrum disorders who have challenges in interpersonal relationships and picking up social cues and processing social cues, can tend to interpret things incorrectly and interpret things incorrectly to the point that they become paranoid or suspicious about people that are trying to interact with them. And of course, that's going to have an overlap of people coming back to the office. I think the culture too is interesting. I'd love to hear your comment on this, because it seems that up until sort of society realizing that we need people like you, there was more of a tendency to think, well, Bob in accounting is a little bit weird, and Cheryl in human resources, she's eccentric, but they're harmless. And maybe 10 years ago or 15 years ago that was true, but now we have to look at those things through a different lens, right?
Absolutely,
And
100%.
and no offense to anyone named Bob that works in accounting, I'm not talking about you.
Right. Well, yeah, and again, like I think we've had this long transition of people slowly being reacclimated to the workplace, and
Yeah.
it's just not the same workplace that they remember. It's not part of their routine. They're not familiar with it, and being reacclimated into this work environment, it's been interesting because for the first part of the transition, we had so much backlog with IT because of numerous people who were so paranoid that people were being watched through their video cameras on
Right.
their computers. And IT had an actual backlog of all these people who just became so paranoid. And there was a sweeping wave of paranoia that was really fascinating and interesting that, we really hadn't seen before. And just in general, I think there's just been a mental health crisis that sweep the workplace where people are feeling uncomfortable, that there's this weird movement of hierarchy. And overall in the United States, 94% of workers have been bullied in the workplace. That number has skyrocketed. 1 in 7 people have felt not safe in the workplace. That number has gone up. People dealing with access to personality disorders, which is one of the biggest challenges that we face with workplace violence. And
Not even going to comment.
I don't know if anyone out there has ever had a supervisor with an access to, or has supervised an access to, or has worked with someone, but this creates, a real hostile and toxic work environment that is considered, considered workplace violence. And what we look at is what's called a pathway to violence. And it starts with a grievance, where someone has type of grievance against someone, whether they feel harassed or bullied or singled out or discriminated against. And those are the types of referrals that we get because that's what starts the pathway to violence. And these cases have a real high potential for causing potential threats or harm against others or the workplace. And it's really unfortunate. I mean, the workplace is a very difficult place to navigate now, and it's supposed to be a place where you feel comfortable and safe and focus on your job. And it's just not like that anymore.
Yeah, I think. Thank you so much for that perspective. It sort of illuminates for me, or highlights the fact that much in the same way that the Me Too movement shifted the conversation about sexuality and gender and oppression in relationships and in the workplace, there's a version of this as well post-COVID where, what used to be okay in work situations and work hierarchies just isn't okay anymore. That sort of, and I talk about this a lot about stress management when I'm doing law enforcement training, is that people don't understand the impact of stress. Like we live in an increasingly stressful world, and we're just boiling the frog. We're just slowly turning up the heat on people. And especially in big urban areas like Southern California, we have so many people, and there is no such thing as like the laid back Southern California lifestyle. I'm not even sure how that idea ever happened, because that doesn't really exist as far as I know. But that level of pressure it's a pressure cooker, right? It's going to pop off sometime. And when people feel that they're being maligned and treated poorly, and sometimes they're supposed to be able to go, especially in big organizations, whether it's a government organization or a private company, you're supposed to be able to know that there's this process where your grievances are going to be addressed in a timely manner, but it doesn't always happen like that.
Right. Exactly. And that's why our team is really critical. And we're trying to get out there. We do trainings, and we really want to change the culture of the work environment. And we also want to know, what's going on. The majority of workplace violence cases, I think 25 to 30% don't even get reported. And we want people
to
reach out to us. And a lot of them are in fear of, retaliation or just indifferent or in denial. And we tell everyone, never worry alone. If you see something, say something. And we want people to reach out to us, and we want to, mitigate these grievances or, these potential issues from, potentially dangerous situations.
So would you be in the position of working with these people one-on-one? If someone has a grievance, like if you've been, is it, walk me through a scenario. Do you get a referral of, hey, we're really concerned about Bob over here?
Yes. It could be a lot of different, it could be a lot of different things. We really we're trying to cast a very wide net. So even if there's an employee that's acting a little bit more bizarre or erratic, or there's just displaying some abnormal behavior, they can kind of reach out to us, and we'll kind of look into and investigate it, collect some information. Or if there's an actual threat that's been made by an employee, of course, that's something that we want to, evaluate in terms of assessing their intention of a potential threat.
Well, that seems a little bit easier almost, because when it's a clear threat, it's like it's boom, 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 you're going to go in the door. But if it's someone that is acting odd or making, their presence is making people uncomfortable, would you intervene at that level?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
And that's when we want to be involved. We want to be proactive. We want to, mitigate any potential issues or problems from escalating. So, if someone is, acting bizarre or displaying, inappropriate behavior that's not their baseline, I can set them up with an interview, and I can kind of gather some more information, and sometimes they'll feel, more comfortable talking to someone like me in a different environment than rather a coworker or supervisor, especially if they're paranoid and they're not very trusting of their workplace. I've found that, having a resource or a support, which is something that I can be, in being able to assess really what's going on with a particular individual, and then assisting them, kind of being a support, whether it's linking them to services or resources, or just kind of giving them, the tools and coping strategies needed to kind of survive in a stressful work environment.
Yeah.
A highly neglected population currently that we're really involved in right now and reaching out to are animal care workers. And these workers are really suffering. They are villainized by the public.
Oh, right.
Because of shelters, they're suffering from a lot of compassion fatigue. There's so much overcrowding. There's just overwhelming stress with this particular population that doesn't really get a lot of attention. And they're really struggling. And so we kind of made it, a priority for us to reach out to them, address any safety concerns they have in the workplace, just whether it's compassion fatigue, stress. But they actually suffer from some of the highest suicide rates among any other professions, right up there with law enforcement and firefighters, because of some of, the type of work that they do, and also, the type of, criticism they can get from, whether it's social media or the community. It's a very challenging profession.
So are you talking about individuals that would work in the
shelters?
Like the shelters? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's interesting because I remember there was a lot of attention focused on the amount of animals that came back to shelters once COVID ramped down. Like everybody wanted a pet.
Right.
When there was COVID and they were home, and then they just as quickly dumped them back at shelters, which is just horrific to think about. Like,
it's awful. And the overcrowding right now, and how understaffed and under budgeted, it really creates just a really difficult problem that they're facing. And again, on social media, they really are bullied and harassed.
In what way? I wasn't aware of this. Can you give us an example and lead us through that?
Sure. Yeah. So there's been quite a few cases actually where there are animals, unfortunately, at the care shelters that have been identified or as potentially dangerous animals, or they're just unfortunately animals that are scheduled to be euthanized.
Okay.
And there are rescue shelters that spend a lot of time attempting to, rescue these animals and find them homes before they are euthanized. And sometimes they're not successful. And there is a community out there that, is enraged at the thought, of course, of having these animals euthanized. And
Okay.
so we had a couple cases where the owner had lost their pet to the possession of the shelter, and the shelter had scheduled that particular pet to be euthanized. And the owner had made a threat saying, if you kill my dog, I'm going to come and kill you. Those types of that community has continues to really, harass and abuse these animal care workers who, in a way are just doing their jobs, but
Yeah.
they're a very, passionate community that makes, extensive threats towards the shelter. And those are threats that we investigate and deal with, almost on a daily basis.
That is a lot. I would not have. I guess I just wouldn't have imagined a scenario like that. However, it does seem that post COVID, people feel, well, I mean, this has been increasing with our increased use of social media, but COVID seems to make it worse, where people are just more willing to make out and out threats. They seem a lot more disinhibited in that way.
Yes, absolutely. And we see that a lot. And we track social media on a daily basis. And the majority of threats we get are through social media, whether it's domestic violence related, whether it's from the animal shelters, and we investigate them. And LAPD's threat management unit, who we collaborate with and is part of the citywide threat assessment team, does a really great job assisting us in investigating these threats. There are times where we reach out to the city attorney's office and assist in filing restraining orders if needed, workplace violence or gun violence restraining orders.
Right.
And, there are a lot of people out in the community who have guns or say they have guns, and they make these threats, and they have to be considered. We have to take them seriously.
Absolutely. And so a GVRO here in the state of California is a gun violence restraining order, and different states have different versions of these. Some states have none at all, which is terrifying. But can you tell a little bit more about that GVRO and what the process is and how it might come to be in a scenario?
So we have a city attorney that's part of the labor relations division that is part of CTAT. And what we do is that we will refer cases to them, and they have a criteria to determine whether or not they believe a gun violence restraining order is necessary, or temporary restraining order, permanent restraining order. They have their set of criteria to determine what would be most appropriate or what would kind of hold up in court. And there are also times where a restraining order, we kind of have to weigh whether or not maybe it's appropriate, but it also might escalate a situation as well, because the person that's filing the restraining order has to, put their name on it and has to appear in court, and they're kind of putting themselves out there, and in a way they could put themselves as a potential target if they weren't before, even more so.
Right. Now there's illumination on them. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's just kind of a lot to weigh, but the city attorneys really do a great job. And so they specialize in workplace violence for the city and assist us with those gun violence restraining orders. And then TMU works with us in serving those restraining orders and upholding them.
So can you give us, we've got like 9 minutes left. And if you can, I want to pick your brain for another 3 hours, but I'm not going to take that much of your time. But I would love to know, for the people that are listening and watching this right now, and the people that are going to be watching this for a long time after this, if you could help them understand what actions to take if they feel uncomfortable in the workplace, what can they do? And we have people that are listening and watching from all over the world, but I think there's commonality here. And if you can illuminate on the process to help normalize for our listeners that it's okay to address these things, and if we're going to normalize it, then what are the steps that they can take?
Right. No, great question. And our motto with the citywide threat assessment team and in threat assessment in general with workplace violence is never worry alone. We want to hear what is going on. What are your safety concerns? Those are something you should share, whether it's with a coworker, friend, family member, supervisor. Especially in today's work environment, trust is something that's very hard to come by. Yeah. And a lot of people just don't feel comfortable talking about safety concerns or personal problems. And that's really a culture that we want to have change. We want to have information shared. Otherwise, we're working in all these, what we call silos of people that have all these different information that, if put together, would be really helpful in preventing something potentially very dangerous, whether it's to themselves, to someone else, or the workplace. And so we really encourage people, if they know something or see something or something's happening to them, just please share, the information. And especially if it's something that's potentially imminent, to contact the police. That is so critical. Some people might feel it's stupid, or they don't feel like it's necessary at the time. But we really encourage people to reach out to someone, if it's the police or whoever it may be. So it's really just the importance of sharing that information, I would say.
Yeah, I think, well, yes. And in response, I believe that most of us have an internal defense mechanism that is built and probably has served us very well, that tells us to minimize things. Mm-hmm. Like, let's not overreact. It's probably not that bad. I need to be more patient with this, or any of the other number of excuses. It's none of my business. That's a big one that you'll see in work environments. Like, well, you know what? I don't want my hands in this, so I'm not going to get involved.
Exactly.
And then you'll have people that are on the other end of the spectrum that are busybodies. I'm a professional busybody. If I could get paid for it, I'd be a millionaire. But there's that thing that where people get uncomfortable with their own level of discomfort. So it's like, well, I don't want to be uncomfortable thinking about how uncomfortable I am with this particular individual or this situation. So I'm going to downplay it. And in downplaying, then no action gets taken. And especially in those moments that you're referring to, those high acuity moments where something may actually be imminent, that's when we would want people to reach out. So what do people do? Like, if you go to a supervisor, we're encouraging people to take action and be aware, be responsible, and they get sort of knocked down a couple of notches by the next level up. What do you do? What do we tell them to do?
You just have to be consistent. And I think there are a lot of people who do feel uncomfortable advising or notifying their supervisors, whether they feel they're complaining or whining, or they're being dramatic, or they'll just minimize their concerns. But it's something that just has to be shared, whether it's with a coworker, if you need to go above your supervisor. If it's so dangerous or has the potential to be dangerous, again, you can contact the police. But the most important thing is sharing it with someone.
Right.
And if someone else has to share that information with someone else, that information has to get into the right hands so that change can be made. And I think there's a time, for your listeners, where we've all felt uncomfortable in the workplace at some point in time. And there are people who are actually afraid to be at work. Maybe they're being harassed or discriminated against or bullied. Yeah. Maybe they're in denial. And like you said, a great point, maybe they're minimizing, what they're experiencing. But again, like I said, you never want to worry alone. It's just information that's so critical that needs to be shared. And again, what we're trying to do as CTAT with some of the trainings is to just change the climate. We want it to be a more encouraging and open environment with open dialogue and trust and rapport. And we have a long ways to go. And I think we want to create an environment where it'd be easy for someone to go to a supervisor and just express some of the issues or concerns that they might be experiencing. And that's where it really starts, is in creating some of that culture change.
Yeah, I love that you brought it back around to the idea of the supervisor. I don't know if my supervisor listens to this podcast. I don't think that they do, but I feel like I have one of the best supervisors I've ever had. I've been very lucky that I've only had like two bad ones in this career, which is pretty good considering how many different places I've worked. But I have a supervisor right now who is so responsive and hits this fantastic point of listening very intently to get all the information, and then knows every single step of what the handbook of our organization says, which is a pretty impressive thing, because my previous experiences with not so good supervisors, when something has been an issue, it's like you're experiencing chaos, and then they're not doing anything to mitigate or help normalize your experience, which is never a good thing.
Right.
So
yeah,
go ahead.
Well, yeah, that the problem is it just compounds the grievance or
Right.
compounds the problem, and it just perpetuates the issue. And there's actually a Senate Bill, I think 553, that's coming, hopefully going to be put into law next July. That's going to implement workplace violence policies everywhere in every entity, where it's going to hopefully assist in these issues where maybe the supervisor's the problem and you can't go to your supervisor
Right.
to address some of these issues. And so each department will have a workplace violence policy and prevention, and kind of just a resource that people can go to and reach out to address some of their safety concerns or problems in the workplace.
Great. Maybe more job opportunities for those of us with the forensic background. I'd love that.
Well, yeah, that would be fantastic.
So I know I don't want to traumatize you here at the end, but can you tell us, I mean, dissertation was the rite of passage. It was the firewalk that we all had to do.
Yeah.
What was your dissertation was on what? Workplace? Was it on violence?
No, it was on malingering.
Malingering.
So,
okay.
Yeah. So this is traumatizing, but I recall using a subtest of the WACE-3, the Wechsler,
Okay.
to assess for malingering in neuropsychology patients that were receiving external incentives or monetary incentives. So they had motivation to fake or feign particular questions on the subtest to make themselves look worse than they actually were. So we identified certain questions that people would actually malinger on. And so that's what my dissertation was on.
Well,
it's published for whoever's interested in looking it up, I guess.
Well, I would love to look at it because I think that's absolutely fascinating. And it's funny. I recently had to take the MMPI again for an evaluation.
Oh,
and
really?
It's so weird as a mental health professional. And I haven't done testing in a long time. So it was like, okay, great. I've forgotten all that stuff. I don't have to feel bad. But I'm such an anxious person that I was like, well, wait, if I answer that way, they're going to think I'm faking good, but I'm not. I just want to be honest. But if I'm too honest, so there's all this narrative going on in your head about it.
Yes. All the reverse psychology. Yeah.
Right. So can I put you on the spot? And you don't have to answer this, but what you talked about dominance as something that would be definitely a big red flag for someone in law enforcement. Is there another thing that's not on the test, but that would be in the background that would be concerning? Like in something that would pop out of the interviews that nixes people out of consideration?
Yeah, and again, I don't want to say just the scale of dominance itself would, nix.
You're right. It's in conjunction with other things.
Yeah, because what happens is I think a lot of people want to appear dominant going into a field like law enforcement. They'll want to kind of convey the image or the message that they can be a police officer and be, that authority figure. And so they can score, high on dominance, but if it's extremely high and then it's matched with something that's extremely low, like empathy or self-control or tolerance, those types of combinations themselves kind of raise some red flags. And then if we see that, and maybe there's a history of maybe domestic violence or interpersonal issues or anger problems, maybe there's a reference somewhere from a girlfriend who said something, some unprofessional type of behavior in his past. All of that kind of, putting the pieces of the puzzle together might suggest to us that, hey, this might be someone to kind of, watch out for and look a little bit more closely, if that makes sense.
It absolutely does. I think if I was to kind of boil it down to a combination of, I like things to go my way and I don't really care about people. That would not be a good combination for law enforcement, right? It might be for a Fortune 500 CEO. I think that they like people with a little bit of ASPD, but not so much in law enforcement.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Well, I am just blown away that you took the time out of your very, very busy life and your very valuable weekend time from your job to come and share with us this. I know. Here's the glitch that we have for anybody that's listening. I am so sorry. I did not get the questions that were supposed to feed on the YouTube channel. Our dear cohort and peer, Abby, was going to help me do that, and I couldn't get the technology working. So We may have to bring you back on for additional questions if we can coerce you in the future. I'll buy you a drink, I promise.
Oh, you're on. I'd be happy to. My
awesome.
pleasure. Sure.
Thank you again, you guys. This is Dr. Ryan Solomon. He's a forensic psychologist for Los Angeles City, working in multiple positions with the threat management and risk management and workplace violence. We are going to link to his dissertation. I think it sounds fucking fascinating, even if just reading the abstract, and hopefully we'll get you on again. Thank you so much for your time, and everybody have a great afternoon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Dr. Scott.
Thanks, Dr. Ryan. Bye-bye.
All right. Have a good one.
You too.
We sincerely thank you for spending some time with us today. LA Not So Confidential is part of the Crawl Space Media Network in partnership with Glassbox Media. Each episode is hosted, produced, and written by Dr. Scott and Dr. Shiloh. Our post-production editing and sweetening magic is handled by the multi-talented Jason Usry of Ear Cult Productions.
The LA Not So Confidential theme, entitled Cool Vibes Film Noir, is composed and performed by the talented Kevin MacLeod. He graciously allows us to use his music via a Creative Commons attribution license, and you can check out all of Kevin's amazing work on YouTube.
All of the resources for each episode can be found on our website at la-not-so-confidential.com. You can find us on Instagram at LA Not So Podcast, on Twitter at LA Not So Pod, and on Facebook at LA Not So Confidential. Media inquiries and bookings are scheduled at alienistentertainment@gmail.com.
Please join us each month on Saturdays at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for a live streaming and very interactive broadcast on YouTube entitled Behind the Couch. Stay tuned to all of our social media for our live streaming scheduling announcements.
Subscribe to LA Not So Confidential so you never miss a new episode. And lastly, we'd be honored if you joined our Patreon at patreon.com/LA Not So Podcast. With a subscription, you get an ad-free listening experience, and you'll be the first notified about upcoming live events, social gatherings, and super cool swag coming your way.
Thanks for listening, and join in with us next time on LA
Not So
Confidential. Bye, folks.